Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is what is this? A Ukraine war, US political, foreign diplomacy analysis video. Where actually I'm not going to be doing much of the analysis. What I've done is fused together or brought together a bunch of different views, although leaning heavily to some degree on Fiona Hill here, who is just a great mind on all things national security, formerly of the National Security Council under Trump 1.0, and then involved in his impeachment as being called upon as a kind of expert and whatnot. But anyway, her and some others, and we'll come to them, cast their views on Trump's approach to foreign policy, to Russia and Ukraine. The question I keep wanting to answer, the question I keep asking is he an agent, an asset, he's kind of useful idiot, or is his policy aligning with Russia's from his own ideological point of view and or from a point of view of those around him in Project 2025, US administration, Heritage Foundation, etc., etc. And my answer at the moment is kind of a bit of everything. You know, people are asking, is he an idiot, like just being manipulated, a puppet on a string with other people pulling those strings? Yes. Does he have his own ideas about international geopolitics that, albeit somewhat simplistic, are informing what he does? Yes. Are his own business dealings concerning Russia and his own experience with Ukraine and the impeachment vis-a-vis Zelensky in 2019 and the javelins, etc., are those things influencing his behaviour? Yes. Do people have compromise on him? Quite possibly. So on and so forth. So, you know, all of these ideas, I think, are plausible and actually quite probable. So it's not that these theories are mutually exclusive. Now, we're going to listen to some differing opinions, although there's quite a bit of overlap concerning Donald Trump's approach to foreign policy, to Russia and Ukraine. I see myself as something of an aggregator, right? So I do the scouring of the internet, so you guys don't have to. I don't want to be just, you know, using other people's content as my own. So please go and check all of these videos out in their original form. They are all fascinating interviews. Fiona Hill's, both the ones I'm going to show you, absolutely, all of them are really interesting in their own rights. I could have collated like another 20 here, but I just thought these are a few videos that I've watched, and whenever I watch them, I'm always thinking about you guys. So I'm like, they've got to hear that bit. They've got to hear that. Oh, I need to tell them that or show them that. And so, you know, I won't give too much analysis myself today. I won't be interrupting these videos. I will be just showing you excerpts from each of them, and hopefully it just means that you don't have to watch all of the hours of these, but you can go and do so if you desire, obviously. And let's start with Fiona Hill in a Foreign Affairs interview.
For this one, but perhaps on the other side of the ledger, Trump isn't really all that prepared for his meetings with Putin. And interpretation, in his view, is kind of meaningless. And having people who actually really understand the situation, who Putin is, and you know what Russia is about, is key as well. Because although it's a hyper-personalized setup in Russia as well, Putin's the main guy. He is where all decision making begins and ends with. He's also just have a system around him. He is a product of the deep state. He actually likes the state in Russia. He uses it. And he's got a whole number of state functionaries like Ushakov, his presidential advisor, Lavrov, the foreign minister, Kirill Dmitriev, who many of us have seen active in these negotiations with the United States, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, who for many people is certainly not a household name and not somebody that people were kind of expecting to see. And all of these people have been in the Russian system for years. Kirill Dmitriev's wife is close to Putin's daughter. Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Sovereign Wealth Fund, is Harvard trained, went to business school, he's worked at Goldman Sachs. His English is impeccable, same with Ushakov and Lavrov. Lavrov, of course, has been foreign minister since time immemorial, it seems, certainly longer than 7 weeks.
I am going to interrupt just here to say this. Trump has around him a number of people who I think are putty in the hands of these very, very experienced Russians. So that Putin sits inside this kind of deep state, if you like, or this highly what am I trying to say? It's been established, a highly established state system that Putin's both a product of, but also shaping very much. He has around him a number of people who are supremely loyal, not always competent in terms of some other positions, but in terms of his foreign policy, I think they're really competent, but also super loyal, so they're not threats to Putin. And he can send out Lavrov and Dmitriev, and they're getting Ushakov. They're going to go and do him a good turn there. Whereas Trump has got loyal, really super loyal people in places, but they're not exactly going to be taking the Russians to task over negotiations over Ukraine, right? And I just think that leaves it leaves Putin in a good position, or his people in a good position, to be able to manipulate the Americans and to take advantage of them. And that there is a weakness there.
And also then the Russian representative at the UN, these guys know what they're doing. And again, they speak impeccable English, and they know all their talking points. They know what country they work for. They know how their system operates. They know all the externalities as well. They've got a kind of a complete picture of the field of play. And I think, what we're sort of seeing with President Trump, which I saw the first time around, he's fixated on the one guy himself, on Putin. He sees other people, the intermediaries around him, basically as just sort of conduits to Putin, or some ways of just sort of facilitating interaction, certainly interpreters, certainly his own staff he doesn't pay any attention to. It's all about being able to sit down with Putin. And when you're not prepared, and when you don't know where the other person is coming from, it's just about his interaction, then of course you're going to be taking on the talking points of Russia, because the only peer he sees in this relationship, it's certainly not Witkoff, it's not Rubio for certain, absolutely not. He's a secretary. He's a secretary of state, but for Trump, he's absolutely a secretary. He's just a member of staff. Waltz, it's the same thing. Witkoff might be a billionaire or a millionaire and a kind of an ambassador, and have had a business role before. But again, he's just brokering a deal. That's how Trump saw Rex Tillerson before, or H.R. McMaster, or John Bolton, or any of the various people who were working for him previously. They were nothing in their own right. They were just facilitators and conduits. And it's the same with a translator. He's not listening really to the words. He's just trying to get the vibe. The very first time I was in one of the phone calls with Putin, I was listening very carefully to the Russian, because the interpreters don't always capture everything. They don't capture the nuances. And particularly when it's the Russian interpreter who's translating into a language that's also not their native language, all kinds of things are missing. And Trump said, what a great conversation. I thought, actually, not really. There was all kinds of menace in what Putin had said. He chooses his words very carefully. Many times when Putin and Trump are interacting, Putin's actually making fun of him. It's completely lost in the translation. I can give lots of episodes of this, or he's goading him and urging him onto something because he's trying to kind of see how he will react. And
so this part of the conversation, or this whole video, plays to the useful idiot role. So he is someone that can be manipulated. He doesn't have the experts around him. He doesn't read, doesn't take intelligence briefings, goes in unprepared to these meetings, these talks with Putin, and Putin he's putty in Putin's hands. He's a useful idiot. So Putin can then manipulate him to do what Putin wants him to do. And we'll see all the different elements of these different roles that Trump may be fulfilling in these different interviews.
Translation, smooths over all of that. That context is absolutely missing, and he doesn't do a readout afterwards. And, we heard, for example, that Witkoff spent several hours one-on-one with Putin. Was anyone translating? Was Witkoff making notes in real time, or was he trying to remember, what was said afterwards? All of this is amateur hour, because it kind of means that you're not really fully cognizant of what it is that the Russians have said beyond, what you've taken on board from their talking points.
And it's worth noting that Witkoff is Steve Witkoff, who is ostensibly the Middle East envoy, certainly not a Russia specialist, a longtime New York real estate mogul who is suddenly in this position. So it's not exactly a worthy successor to Fiona Hill who's doing this. Publicly, Russian leaders have reacted to Trump.
And that's the point there. I mean, I'm going to forward this on marginally to the next point, but the point there is completely salient. you've got rank amateurs, and actually Fiona Hill said this is amateur hour. You've got rank amateurs in these positions where you need like the very best. You need the very best people in the world that you can ever think of if you're going to be negotiating with the frickin' Kremlin. Like, I would be pulling my hair out what few there are left just to work out exactly who would be the best people to negotiate on my behalf so that I get whatever outcome I want, or I would be working on behalf of Ukraine there. But obviously Trump is working on behalf of himself. But again, just putting in people that might otherwise be loyal, and Marco Rubio, that's you're hoping for the best there, because that's someone who slagged you off a lot before, and now you're putting into a position where he's going to be fighting on your behalf. These are rank amateurs. They really, really are. And that leaves the US, that leaves Trump very vulnerable to manipulation.
Real mixed picture. I mean, as you said, there's been quite a bit of euphoria in Russia. In fact, they think that they've, walked into a fairy tale, kind of where, there's all these Russian fairy tales where somebody finds a golden fish or a firebird, or, it's like the genie in the lamp kind of equivalent, and all their wishes come true. And in many respects, that's what's happened. Putin wanted Ukraine to capitulate. It looks like that's what Trump is trying to facilitate for him. Putin wanted to see a rift between the United States and NATO, and the United States and all its European allies. And Trump's doing that in spades, and also with Canada and Mexico and pretty much everybody else as well. The Russians would have loved the United States in every other interaction to just take on their talking points without any, kind of pushback. And that's exactly what's happened as well. And the thing is, what we've done here is we've just gone completely over to the Russian side of the position, which is not necessarily good for Russia either. And I think that that's kind of also creating, some apprehension in Moscow. What does this mean? Does this, actually mean that the United States has completely shifted its position? I mean, Trump, certainly has been of many of these views all the way along, because he's a strong man. He sees Putin as a peer, as a fellow strongman. He wants to rule the United States in the way that he thinks, that Russia is ruled by Putin. But Putin is...
Okay, so then we're moving on towards we've gone from useful idiot being able to be manipulated by Russia, moving on to this idea that he's also aligned to Russia. So, and these aren't mutually exclusive, right? So you can be both. But he's aligned to Russia in many of his ideals, and you can look back in history as to why that is. And then you can question, well, is that alignment due to compromise from, say, not necessarily compromise, but bribery or whatever, business dealings that keep him in Russia's pockets going back to 1987, right? I had that interview with Zarina Zabriskie where she's giving you a long washing list of all of the times and places where, there seems to be this connection between Trump and Russia. And so you're thinking, okay, and then it gets to this point where he's aligned and wants to achieve things that Putin also wants to achieve. But then you're tracking that causally back to, well, actually, why is he aligned? But anyway, the point here is that there is some alignment as well.
Also himself is beholden to public opinion. There's also kind of like a whole series of war bloggers and nationalists and others, who are also trying to hold Putin's feet to the fire. And there's also kind of, a lot of anxiety about whether the United States and Trump can be trusted to stick to their word. Because the first time around, Putin also was hopeful, and all the Russians were very hopeful. They were popping champagne corks when Trump got elected, because, they certainly didn't want to see Hillary Clinton elected in 2016. But they didn't get what they wanted out of it. Trump himself keeps saying, I was tougher on Russia than anyone else. Well, that was also not true. But in fact, it was the team of people around him who, once, Russia started doing various things, basically persuaded Trump that he needed to push back or he would look weak. But Trump has never believed that Russia has been interfering in the political space. And so he wants to now take, Putin at his face value, irrespective of all the things that, kind of Russia has actually done. And in a way now, the Russians are kind of feeling that maybe they're the dog that caught the car. And so they're not really sure where this is going to go. And in fact...
She goes on to talk here about the dog that caught the car. You catch up the car and you're like, oh, what now? And so there's this element that the Russians have now captured Trump, and they've got Trump, and Trump's their man. And they're like, oh, now what do we do? Holy crap, we haven't actually thought this through properly. And actually, there are some challenges to having him so firmly on side. And it can cause some issues that might have been otherwise unpredicted. And so lots of interesting dynamics going on there. But I am actually going to forward this on to another point in this interview much later to get another sense of these dynamics going on. Right.
Best going forward. Can you imagine this being a really durable change in how we think about global order?
Well, only if nobody else in the world has any agency. And that's kind of the part of the problem. Next year is the 250th anniversary of the US Revolution and Independence. And, we seem to have gone from one king to a self-proclaimed king. And Trump is using, and the people around him, this idea of unitary executive to kind of recreate something that the US cast off 250 years ago. But that's obviously part of Trump's worldview. He obviously sees himself as a king. I mean, I would take that literally. I mean, the way that he, had the mock time cover on the White House website. Just look at the White House website and you can see kind of exactly what it is that Trump would like the United States to be. Now, in the case of Russia, that gets back to our mindset. It's not just the strong man, the spheres of influence, the sort of old-style imperialism. I mean, and of course, we're hearing a lot about McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt and all kinds of people that Trump never talked about before. But obviously, he's had a crash course in, how they behaved and how they conducted themselves, like Andrew Jackson, from the 1820s as well. But he's kind of going back to sort of an 18th century style of governance too. In the 18th century, when Catherine the Great, who was an idol of Putin's rather, was ruling Russia, because Putin sees himself in a long line of czars and has taken the Russian presidency back to the Tsarist era, not a constitutional monarchy, but monarchy with great powers. Well, he sees himself as a czar, if not a king. But in that period, the great powers of Europe were carving the place up among themselves.
And this is all fascinating. So he sees himself as the same kind of leader as Putin. So there's that alignment, the same kind of ideology, but it might not even be ideology. He might not even be that thoughtful, Trump. It's about power. It's not that I know what to do with the power once I have it. I just want the power as a kind of means to an end. It's an end in and of itself. Just having power. I see Putin has that. I see Kim Jong-un has that. I see Jair Bolsonaro had that, and I liked him. Viktor Orban, Xi Jinping. These are the people I look up to, and I want to do things very similar to how they do things. And then that allows me, and then this is where you could get some ideology coming in, but I don't know that it's his ideology, although that of people around him, that if Trump gets power, then we as the administration, Project 2012, or whatever you want to call it, these people say, right, we can see the world in a tripolar sense where us and Russia and China can carve up the world, including Europe, for our own ends.
America at that point was a colony, or what was parts of America in that period, and up until the War of Independence. But in that same time frame that the US is getting or Americas are getting their independence from Great Britain, Poland was being carved up by the Russia of Catherine the Great, Prussia and Austria-Hungary, without the Poles having any say in it whatsoever. And I think that that's the vision that Trump has. I'm not sure that Putin's quite, right there, or she is in China, but that's kind of basically what Trump is proposing. He's, I think, misrepresenting or misassessing, if that's a word, the strength of Russia and Russia's ability to do that, but he's not necessarily wrong about China. And basically what he's proposing here is a kind of tripartite carving up of the world. It's certainly what the rest of the world is assuming is what they want. And, again, that could work.
Exactly what I was saying earlier, that kind of tripolar world.
If it wasn't for the fact that there are now 8 billion people on the planet, that there are a whole host of other countries, there are 550 million people in Europe, who have all kinds of different modes of association. And there are rising powers like India, Brazil, and, many others who want to have their role. And I was going to say on that, the nuclear powers now, because you've got Iran and North Korea that aspire to be nuclear powers. Obviously, countries like South Africa and Israel, India and Pakistan as nuclear powers. You've got Japan and South Korea that are major economic powers. You've basically got a very complicated world out there. So you might have that model and you might think you have the power to do this. And certainly Putin and Trump seem to have very generous estimates of their power. But that's not the world that we're in. We're in a very complicated world. And they may try to do this, but I'm not sure that everyone else is going to cooperate.
Really interesting analysis there, and how a very simplistic idea like carving out the world as three great empires doesn't really comport with how the world really is set up these days with Europe, the EU, Europe as a whole, and then all these other players. You think about the importance of Saudi Arabia now, just as a single country, and then the Middle East as a whole. And then, of course, you've got India. How does that feature with regard to the Chinese empire or the Russian empire? And is BRICS a thing? But then there are all those issues within BRICS and so on and so forth. How does Brazil fit in? And then you got Japan. So I think these simplistic ideas going back to looking at how the world was operating in times gone past doesn't really work in today's world. Okay, last one from this particular video.
It's not just a world of three powers.
Listening to you and watching Trump's interactions with Putin and with Zelensky and his statements on this whole set of issues over the last couple of months, it's hard not to come back to this question, this kind of enduring mystery of what is at the root of Trump's attraction or fealty to Putin. As you look at it, is it all just that kind of similarity of worldview, his kind of envy of Putin's power? There are still people who, for all the overstatement of some of the Russiagate conspiracy theories last time around, who still believe there's some, degree of compromise. But as you've watched this, how do you explain this in your mind? What is the root of this as you see it?
I think he's fundamentally really enamored of Russia and doesn't see it as a threat at all. And there's a lot going around, as you said, about all these kind of questions about what do the Russians or the Soviets have on him. All kinds of people are posting things all over the place about his first visits to Moscow and the Soviet Union, how he was hosted, as many others were, and how he was probably compromised then. I think he was very much enamored of the Soviet Union at the time. He's very much in the 1980s realm. That period of 1980s was when Gorbachev, comes in. And, I went to study in Russia at the same time, 1987. I really, kind of thought that Russia was on a different trajectory. We have Gorbachev and Reagan meeting, you have the signing of the INF. You have this kind of feeling that the whole place is changing, that they're no longer clinging to the old communist ideology, that there's new thinking in foreign policy. They all seem extraordinarily sympathetic. This is a whole period of, all the kind of peace movements and people doing outreach. Bill Clinton, Bernie Sanders, everybody goes to Moscow in this kind of period. And of course, they're going to be whining and dining in an American businessman. And I'm sure that, he really felt flattered because Trump always responds to flattery.
Which is to say that this is I talk about agent, asset, and there's overlap between asset and useful idiot, and then alignment. So this is alignment, but also goes over into the asset, useful idiot. You can be aligned and also be very much used by Russia.
And, then we have Gorbachev, we have the collapse of the Soviet Union, we have Yeltsin. Everybody thinks that the Russians have made a strategic choice. You have all these Russian business people emerging. Many of them invest in Trump's businesses, buy his apartments. He meets all these oligarchs and, who are just like him, billionaires with beautiful wives, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think he's changed his view at all about Russia and the trajectory that it's on. I don't think he believes for 1 second that Putin has been out to get him. He, just like with Gorbachev, who wanted to sit down and basically negotiate nuclear weapons with, he sees Putin very similarly. And, in actual fact, although Putin may be a KGB operative, Trump's a total operative. He thinks in the same way. Conspiracy theories, lies, these are all kind of part of his coin of business as well. He's a real estate mogul. I mean, I actually hadn't pegged him for being an imperialist, but I think I hadn't probably taken his interest in real estate to its logical conclusion. It's a great development of a literal greenfield site of Greenland. And, he operates in the same sort of way as Putin. It's one of the reasons why they don't want to clamp down on disinformation here in the United States. They don't want to clamp down on money in politics because it's extraordinarily useful for Trump. Trump and Putin are working in parallel tracks. And again, Trump doesn't basically have any respect for anyone apart from himself or people who thinks are his peers. And the people who thinks are his peers are a very small number of people. Putin's one of them. She is another. The Queen was one, but she's gone now. He's got the richest man in the world operating as his tech support, according to his T-shirt, of Elon Musk. How more powerful could he possibly be? And so, that's the way that he's thinking about this. He thinks of Putin as an extraordinarily powerful individual. He's got name recognition, face recognition. Even Americans who can't tell, one US senator or one member of the cabinet from the other recognize Putin. They know who he is. Elon Musk is one of the most recognizable people, on the planet, and so is Trump. And that's how he thinks about things. And so, of course he's compromised. Of course he's an asset because he can be manipulated. He can be flattered. People are always coming up to me and getting really angry with me because...
And this is it. So we've got the alignment, but then that also working together with being easy to manipulate because possibly he's aligned and he looks up to Putin, wants to be like Putin, so wants to take the US in that autocratic direction. And that means that he is willingly kind of embracing that end goal and anything that gets him there, which will be possibly underhand influence from Russia to get him to that point.
Because they'll say, well, what have the Russians got on him? We've all got stuff on him. I mean, for God's sake, there's been 90 cases, kind of basically in courts against him. He's already been found, guilty on some charges, so come on. I mean, it's more about the flattery. And the bigger and, more important you are and the more you flatter him, the more impact that has. And as I said, Putin is always extraordinary.
Which is what Vlad Vexer calls narcissistic submission. So if he's getting flattery from people like Vladimir Putin, and Putin knows that he can do that and just have, as I say, Trump as putty in his hands, then, that makes him extraordinarily vulnerable.
Really clever, even though, in fact, he does make fun of him in Russian. And Putin is always saying nice things about Trump. And so, as Trump doesn't believe in the interference, he'd rather believe it was Ukraine, or he doesn't believe that there was a real Russian effort on his behalf. That's why he says that he and Putin have been through so much together. It's almost like a kind of a teenage romance where everybody's been trying to keep them apart. And he just wants to get back together with Putin in spite of everybody. And he's doing whatever he absolutely can to have that sit down with him.
Could you share just one of those examples of Putin making fun of Trump in Russian?
Well, one of the classics was in Osaka at the G20, which is also another famous incident where the Russians swapped out their interpreter for a very attractive, very skilled young woman. During that moment, they were standing off and chest beating about who had hypersonic missiles first, and Trump was saying he would get them, and Putin was basically somewhat sarcastically saying, yes, you will, but I've got them first, kind of thing. And then they started talking about Israel, and we did have this really amazing historic meeting among the national security advisors of Israel, Russia, and the United States that came around this time, because at that point the Russians were trying to make the case that they were protecting Israel and being, supportive of Israel by being in the Golan Heights and the activities that they were doing in Syria. And Putin was talking about this, and then Trump said, but I do more for Israel than anybody else. They've named this after me and that after me in Israel. And Putin looked at him and said, well, Donald, perhaps they should name the country after you. And the way that he said it in Russian, it was so sarcastic. And you could see, kind of his guys around him smirking. But when the interpreter, who was the only person that Trump was looking at, basically said it just kind of came out as more sort of softer. And Trump responded and said, oh, no, I think that would be too much. Almost as if it was a kind of a genuine suggestion. And there were other things like this where Putin would deliberately set him off, goading him to say terrible things about fellow Americans, be it Biden or Senator Warren, who we would call Pocahontas also to Putin. And look, I mean, honestly, I found that shocking, and I talked about that publicly, and I, said it in written materials too. When your president throws you under the bus with a foreign leader who, really doesn't care for you in the slightest, it tells you something. Because basically, what Trump...
That is really actually despicable, because you should be circling around the wagons in terms of your own nation, and you start throwing opposition politicians out to a foreign leader like Putin, throw them under Putin's bus. I think that's despicable. Your first job as a president should be the safety and security of your people, and that includes all of your politicians. These are just opposition leaders. They're not mortal enemies, but Trump sees them as mortal enemies and sees Putin as closer to him than Democrats, and that is a really disturbing state of affairs.
Always wanted to be was the big strong guy in front of Putin, and he does that by beating up on the people he can beat up on. He takes on very deliberate and very strategically people who he doesn't think are going to fight back, which of course Zelensky actually did in the Oval Office, or people that he can humiliate and kind of look weak to look stronger to the other person. And it's obvious to Putin he's doing that. Let's just be frank. it's pretty obvious, because it's obvious to everybody else as well.
There you go. So really fascinating stuff from Fiona Hill. We're going on to Malcolm Nance now, who was a intelligence officer in Ukraine, worked in intelligence in the US, worked as an intelligence analyst for MSNBC News, and now has his own Substack and YouTube and etc. etc. I'm due to interview him tomorrow on Saturday UK time, and this is what he has to say. And we'll start off with a short bit. Actually, this whole chat with Jake Pro was fascinating with Malcolm Nance. We're only going to look at a couple of bits in this one.
He was an illegal immigrant in the United States, but now he's part of the Silicon Valley tech bros made up of 4 South African billionaires. And people ask me, hey, Malcolm, what is the whole US, Canada, Greenland thing? There is a philosophy.
Okay, and just to give you the connection here, so this is going back to what Fiona Hill was saying in did she say it in that last one we just went through, or the one we're going to show at the end? Anyway, she has talked about how important. No, it's one at the end actually, so she hasn't talked about it yet. But Fiona Hill also talks about how important Elon Musk is in shaping policy, and so this is where there's an alignment, right? So when you talk about why does Trump do X, Y, and Z, it's because he's aligned. But when I talk about Trump being aligned, I mean he or the Trump administration. And in this case, the Trump administration includes 4 South African oligarchs: Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, David Sachs, and is it Andreessen as well? These people are controlling the White House to some significant degree, and they're also controlling, I think, foreign policy or influencing foreign policy. I've talked about this on another video with regard to Elon Musk, SpaceX and Tesla, and natural resources from Russia and China, and actually needing maybe land in Tehran, China and Russia in terms of relay stations. This is something that Fiona Hill talks about as well. And when you're talking about alignment, that will also include other people taking the US administration and therefore Trump in that direction, same direction as Putin.
Philosophy I want your viewers to look up that is very, very, very close to Russia's neo-Eurasianism, which was Alexander Dugin's philosophy that Europe must fall into the influence of Russia and Russia would be the main political pole in the Eastern Hemisphere. There is a philosophy called neo-reactionism, which under this guy named Curtis Yarvin, a total nut, that believes democracy is a failure and that the United States must create a technit of America under a dictatorship of the techno monarchy, where a Silicon Valley billionaire would create a dictatorship and would seize all land of Canada and Greenland using the natural resources to expand technology. Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, and David Sachs are all followers of this crazy philosophy.
Of course.
And it explains everything. If you would go to the New York Times and watch the 45-minute video of Curtis Yarvin and his philosophy of neo-reactionism and the article, how it has taken over Washington, D.C.
So the idea that the US want Canada and Greenland, and you're thinking, okay, there's some kind of expansionism here, that maybe also isolationist, where they want to isolate themselves from the world, become self-sufficient. In order to become self-sufficient, they need the resources from Canada and Greenland. Actually, might be something that is being proposed to Trump and the administration from those South African oligarchs that looks like the kind of thinking of Yarvin here.
This is where this pro-Moscow, they're rabidly pro-Moscow, this pro-Moscow act like Russia towards Canada and Greenland philosophy comes from. It's the craziest thing I have ever heard next to QAnon, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS. This is the greatest threat that's ever touched this country.
And there you go. So make of that what you will. But, I think that also goes a good way to understanding Trump's position, which is that, he is being manipulated not just from external forces like Russia and the Kremlin and Putin, but he's being manipulated by those in his inner circle. His inner circle. He is the puppet on a string, and with the strings being pulled by the Project 2025 lot, Vort and maybe Stephen Miller and etc., etc. But then you've got these South African oligarchs and others to boot. Another little section from Malcolm Nance.
The question is, what would be the precipitating event? Well, the precipitating event was his inauguration. This anger that he had at Zelensky went way back. And don't forget, J.D. Vance, who flipped on a dime about Donald Trump, also flipped on a dime about Ukraine.
And he's just having talked about the going back to the attempt to extract blackmail or dirt on the Biden family through Ukraine, through Zelensky, and blackmailing Zelensky with arms that actually, and Malcolm Nance talks about this, even though Donald Trump talks about how he was responsible for the javelins going to Ukraine. Of course, it wasn't. It was Congress, John McCain, etc., people there that passed it, and then Donald Trump was president, so he ended up doing it, but that actually held it back. He was the one, if you like, that almost vetoed it by using it as blackmail. So it's worth understanding that. And that's the grudge he holds. That's why he's got a grudge against Zelensky. And that also goes some way to understanding why his positioning is like it is. It's not only all of these things we've been talking about, but also the fact that he hates Zelensky because Zelensky stopped him getting dirt on Biden, and that led to his impeachment, or attempted impeachment.
Got into some contentious, regrettable fights with a spokesperson from strategic communications. These people just took a malignant Moscow first attitude towards anything that reflected Ukraine. Trump, I've written 4 books about Trump and his relationship with Vladimir Putin and Russian intelligence. Trump is a deep, deep bench admirer of Vladimir Putin's ruthless authoritarianism.
And this is where you're going back to having this alignment. This is what Fiona Hill was talking about. He loves a strongman. This strongman adulation leads Trump to take actions that align himself with Putin because he admires Putin that much. He wants to be a Putin, and to be a Putin, he has to do the sorts of things that Putin did to get the kind of power that Putin has. And that's why we're seeing the US go down this authoritarian track.
As the former Prime Minister of Australia put it, he is in love with Vladimir Putin. When he was in Helsinki, he sat in complete submission to Putin. He dissed his own intelligence agencies, which he doesn't trust. He doesn't believe in U.S. intelligence. He doesn't trust U.S. intelligence, which is why he put such a malicious agent as Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence, a woman who came from the army in psychological operations, who was a friend to warlords, an admirer of Russia and Putin. And you knew she was going to flip on a dime. You knew she would carry out cutting off information.
And then he goes on to talk about Ukrainian intelligence after that. But I think that was an interesting number of points that he made. We're going to go on to David Frum here, who used to write speeches, did he not, for one of the Bushes. So he's a Republican. Formerly, I think Nance was a Republican initially, just out of interest. And of course, Fiona Hill worked for a Republican administration. So, it's not like these are Democrats having a go at Trump. These are people trying to understand why Trump is acting in the way he does.
Is part of the deal. So no one in China is going to take seriously that Trump is trying to contain them. What they can see instead is that he's smashing up the alliance system that is the only hope to contain China.
Do you see any method in the madness, or do you just see madness?
I see malignancy more than madness. I don't think the president is literally crazy. I mean, he believes a lot of things that are not true. But my late father, in the days of handwritten cafe bills in Europe, would always minutely examine the handwritten cafe bill, and he said, if they were just bad at math, you would expect half the mistakes to be in my favor.
Okay.
So
yeah.
So I don't think Trump is delusional in many ways, but the delusions are always in favor of Putin, in favor of anti-democratic establishments. And let's take the point where it's sometimes said that Trump is attacking the Europeans to get the Europeans to spend more on defense. So why is it that the countries he most mistrusts are those that are doing just what he says, that his co-president, Elon Musk, personally abused the Polish foreign minister and then the whole state of Poland, which has the highest and most robust defense program in Europe, And what is the party in Europe they relentlessly champion is the Alternative for Germany, which is a party that opposes increases in defense spending. This is not about more defense spending to counter Russia. This is about not countering Russia.
I mean, it's certainly true that Trump's been
Absolutely, that's what you've got to look at. We're going to go forward to another part of this fascinating discussion that these guys have.
the world for the sake of America alone.
The way American leadership since World War II has thought about matters is take the Greenland story that you hear so much about. So Greenland, home to 80,000 people, is a territory of the Kingdom of Denmark, which is not a military factor. If the United States wanted to seize Greenland, it easily could. And if it wanted to suppress the 80,000 people of Greenland, if they attempted an insurgency, I mean, we're talking mad projects here, but if the United States could do all those things. So why does it not? Well, the answer is because American presidents since 1945 have understood that America's supreme interest is a system of non-aggression. The United States fought the three major wars the United States fought between the end of World War II and the end of the 20th century were all in defense of boundaries. Fought a war in Korea against the North Korean invasion of the South, fought a war in Vietnam against the North Vietnamese invasion of the South, and fought a war in Kuwait against the Iraqi attempt to abolish the Kuwaiti state. And these states weren't all great states. South Vietnam, even Kuwait, have a lot of, they're not exactly democracies, but the United States said, invasions across international borders are so dangerous. The project of abolishing states altogether is so dangerous, we will even use military power to stop it. That's our interest. And so the idea of picking up some frozen acreage in Greenland, a country which is a member of the EU and a member of NATO, Greenland is a territory, I should say, member of EU, member of NATO. If you want to open a mine, there is a legal structure where mining can be done. If you want to increase the 200 American personnel in Greenland today to 400, the Danes would surely say yes. They've often asked for more in the past. Every legitimate interest of the United States could be served through cooperation. But for Trump, the predation...
This is a really important point he goes on to make, but this goes back to the idea of you getting. Fiona Hill talks about living in a previous time. Going back into history and into an imperialist history of carving up the world, and that's kind of where Trump is at. But then also you take into account Nance's thinking about Yavin, that actually there are people around him that also want this. So it's not just about kind of an old school expansionism. That fits in also, that aligns itself with the Yavin approach to what these oligarchs are wanting, and the natural resources of Canada and Greenland for their own sort of grifting outcome.
Predation is the end.
So he's talking about predation, sorry.
But for Trump, the predation is the end.
Not cooperation.
That is a new chapter because, as I say, we fought in Korea, Vietnam, and Kuwait to say no predation.
Let's turn now then to the Republican Party, the one that you knew and were a part of.
So predation ends up being an important part. So we're now going to go on to the last bit from just to get some more views that might be of interest. Here we go.
Personal grievances. But Trump is not really a consistent or ideological person. Vance is. Vance is not so much pro-Russian in the way that Trump is, where there's a personal bond between Trump and Putin. I don't think there's a personal bond between Vance and Putin. Instead, Vance is part of a larger transatlantic far right that sees the Russian state as an example of what they're trying to build in their own countries. So he is as attached to Viktor Orban, as attached to the Alternative for Germany, as attached to the parties of the far right elsewhere in Europe and the UK. And what he was trying to do was, Vance also understood that the Republicans in the Senate still mostly support Ukraine and want to be on side and want to be helpful, even as they fear Trump. So he was trying to create a contradiction where it had to be either for Zelensky or for Trump. He was trying to intensify that. And whereas most of the Republican senators are trying to smooth it and say, I'm for Trump and for Zelensky, Vance was trying to create a personal conflict, which is the kind of conflict Trump never can forgive, in front of the TV cameras, which makes it, again, even more powerful for Trump. And then turn to the Republican senators and say, see, it's choose. It's Zelensky or Trump. There's no middle ground. There's no way to support both.
That makes it sound like he knows exactly what he's doing, Vance, in a way that Trump certainly doesn't.
I don't think Donald Trump when he wakes up in the morning, knows what he's going to do at bedtime. But I think Vance is working backwards from 2028 and has got a list of things to do every minute between now and 2028. As I said, I don't know that he will be the next Republican nominee. I don't know that there will be any other.
Which is to say, there's an element of Trump doesn't know what he's going to do in the evening when he wakes up in the morning. In other words, he fires from the hip. There's an intuition. He wants to be like Putin. And if the people around him push him in that direction by giving him rationale to suggest that he's going to get into power, into a position of power like Putin, then he's going to embrace it with everything he's got. And that then leaves him easy to be manipulated by the people around him and by Putin, shoving the US in this dictatorial authoritarian direction that aligns itself with Russia and therefore by extension against Ukraine. That's what's going on. And if you add in the possibility that he himself has been either directly compromised, there's compromat on him, or that, he's done business deals or this or that. There are all these ways with which he is compromised in a serious way with agency, or compromised in a way where he is just even more easily manipulated. You put all of these things together and the US is moving in that direction towards a Putin-esque type scenario. And there's nothing I can disagree with basically all of these points that people are making. And we're now going to go on to Joe Walsh. So Joe Walsh is a very outspoken former Republican lawmaker, sort of a bit like Adam Kinzinger in a way that, now is railing against Trump from a position of being a former Republican. I don't know if he's former or he still is, but he's certainly very outspoken about Trump. And here is Joe Walsh talking about Trump's kind of strategizing.
This morning, Russia bombed Ukraine's energy grid. Do you think that Trump is being played here by Putin?
Well, that's an interesting question. Is Trump being played by Putin? No, I think Trump's doing Putin's work for him.
Alignment.
I think Trump's negotiating on behalf of Putin. I think we've always gotten this wrong. I understand that Trump is an idiot and he doesn't really know what he's doing.
So when he says alignment, then we start talking about, but also he's manipulatable to align himself with Putin, but also wants to be like Putin. And it's all that we've heard previously said in different ways, but there is this idea that all of these ideas are operating simultaneously.
And people who flatter him, that's really all you have to do with
useful idiot.
But we've misunderstood from the beginning this relationship with Putin. He likes Putin. He stands with Putin. I think he works for Putin. I think he's a Russian asset. So when you look at it in that regard, it all makes perfect sense. He pressures Ukraine. He wants Ukraine to do all these things. He's got a demand list for Ukraine. But for Putin and Russia, really nothing. And so I don't think he's being played. I think Trump's doing what Putin wants him to do, because I think that's what Trump wants to have happen as well.
I mean, Trump would obviously say he's not a Russian asset. Why do you think that he is one?
Everything. I mean, everything. Donald Trump has said and done from the moment, and I'll just go back that far, from the moment he came down that escalator in 2015 and announced his run for president. Everything he's said and done since then, vis-a-vis Russia or the world, has been to Putin's benefit.
100%.
Period. If he's not a Russian asset, the best you could say is he's Putin's puppet. Like he just wants to please Putin. I think it's worse than that. I think Trump has a history of business dealings in Russia going way back. I think Russian oligarchs were the only ones to lend him money way back. I don't know in particular, but if he's not a Russian asset, he's been acting like one for at least 10 years.
Many of the...
And again, I don't disagree with that either. All of these are apparently true as far as I can work out. Then we have Professor Robert Kelly talking on Times Radio.
Bob, so many people think that the way Donald Trump interacts with Vladimir Putin is a strategy, that he knows how to deal with someone with such a dictatorial nature. And perhaps he sees himself in him, we don't know. But do you think that's true? Or are you more of the understanding that Donald Trump is actually pro-Russia winning this war?
I think, okay, that's actually a really great question. I'm not actually of the school that says that Putin has some kind of like compromising material. I think just Donald Trump doesn't really believe in democracy and checks and balances and limits on executive authority and stuff like that. You know, if you listen to him on Twitter and on TV and his social media service, he constantly talks about, you know, how the president has unlimited authority and the president can do whatever he wants, and how Al Capone was great. He just said on Twitter the other day, the great Al Capone, right? I mean, he has this kind of gangsterish mentality about the office, and I think that's what's provoked so much anxiety. You see that in the way that Elon Musk is sort of cutting away through the government without going through Congress. Trump is governing through executive order. I mean, it's, you know, there's a big debate, is Trump a fascist? I don't want to go there, but I mean, he has a kind of authoritarian style, which I think is what brings him to be more comfortable around authoritarians. Kamala Harris said this in the election last year, and I think she was correct, that he likes autocrats because he wants to be one. And I think, I genuinely think that Donald Trump is a threat to U.S. democracy. I share that opinion. And I think that's one of the reasons why he likes Putin. I think he admires the way Putin governs Russia and would like to govern like that inside the United States, where, of course, he faces much greater institutional checks. So I think that's really all it is. I don't actually think there's some kind of conspiracy out there and the rest of it. But the real problem, of course, is that because he likes Putin so much, right, it looks an awful lot like he's going to sort of throw the Ukrainians under the bus. And I think that's the real problem. If you're the Europeans, that's simply not an acceptable outcome, because that feeds Russian aggression, and then they're going to come back in a couple of years. And I think this is where there's going to be a European-U.S. breach, because the Europeans are not, and the Ukrainians are not going to agree to a deal that just sort of throws Ukraine to the Russians. I mean, that would be terrible for European security, and they're going to fight. And I don't know if Trump cares enough to resolve that without just allowing NATO to fracture.
And there you go. So he, again, it's this alignment because he had such adulation for Putin. Just a few seconds of what he says at this point, Kelly.
A great deal in the conflict. So maybe that's the master plan. But honestly, I'm not sure that Donald Trump is playing like 8-dimensional chess. I think he's just kind of winging it, to be honest.
And again, I know that's a bit of a throwaway comment, but that's really important. That's exactly the same as we heard David Frum say. He gets up in the morning, doesn't know what he's going to do at the end of the day. There's no plan, there's no long-term strategy, there's no massive agenda other than wanting more power because he likes the look of power in other people. And so he will do things that align with someone who has that power, which then makes him susceptible to manipulation from those people, as I've said already. Now we're going to look at him putting some meat on the bones of that claim about, you know, not being able to play 4-dimensional chess.
20 years
or 8-dimensional
rebels in the jungle. Yeah, I mean, I just don't know. Again, this is what I mean when I think that Donald Trump isn't really playing 8-dimensional chess. I just don't think the president is really thinking this through. I think these things kind of come into his head and he just kind of shoots them out on the internet, on Truth Social or whatever. He doesn't really have a lot of good impulse control. I think we can all agree about that with Donald Trump. And he just says this stuff, right? And he gets sort of hung up on things. I would be shocked if the United States were to actually try to use force to annex Canada. But to your point, I mean, he does keep bringing it up, right? I mean, it was, I guess, kind of funny, you know, a month ago. And I mean, I think Americans maybe are a little bit to blame about this, right? Because the Americans often kind of treat Canada like it's a joke and it's not really its own country, you know, South Park movie and all that. But I mean, we shouldn't actually, right? I mean, Canada's actually been a really good partner of the United States for a really, really long time, right? They were at Normandy. They helped us a lot after 9/11. I mean, Canada's been an excellent neighbor for the United States for a century. And it's really kind of shocking. And I just don't, again, I don't know what the Trump endgame here is, right? Alienating Canada, right? I mean, what purpose does that, how does that suit American national security? Unless we're actually going to absorb Canada and invade it, there's no point to constantly provoking them. And of course, if we invaded Canada, that would just be, I mean, that would break NATO overnight. The United States would be completely isolated. So I'm actually pretty surprised. I imagine that most of the people around the president know that this is an error. I would imagine that NSA Waltz.
this is where I'd sort of disagree. Most of the people around him, I think, probably are okay with that, and some of the people aren't. And I think that some of the people aren't, maybe Mike Waltz, Marco Rubio, but they're beholden to the people who are, because they lose their jobs. And if Elon Musk wants it, then all that money that Elon Musk has means that if you don't want it, that you will be primaried and you will be you'll be out on your ear. So yeah, I would somewhat disagree with that, but you get the point.
And Secretary of State Rubio both would like the president to stop talking about this, but
yeah, agree with them.
The Republican Party is kind of cultish now. Trump is like the great leader.
Exactly.
He says stuff, and people just aren't willing to contradict him the way they were, when he first emerged like 10 years ago.
Absolutely, 100% there. So that's good stuff from Kelly. Then now we're going to go on to no, we're not, on to Fiona Hill again, and we're going to listen to a few excerpts here. I'm going to go back to this point in the conversation.
I think you're just calling it like you see it, which I think is how most people see it, including in Europe and in Ukraine. President Trump was recently on Air Force One. I think yesterday I was reading, some reports where he was talking about how over the weekend he got it all worked out in Mar-a-Lago. Well, who was he working it out with? His own team? There's a lot of, as you're putting it here, negotiating with ourselves on the US side, or at least, Trump and his immediate circle. A lot of talking to Putin going on. Steve Witkoff, meeting with Putin for many hours and hearing Russia's side of the argument here. And then them going to Ukraine and putting a lot of pressure on Ukraine. And as you're also pointing out, the Europeans have had to basically go into a parallel negotiation channel. I mean, it's certainly the case that we've had President Macron of France, Prime Minister Starmer of the United Kingdom, and others were trying to interact with President Trump on this. But it really feels, in many respects, like they're fighting, in some respects, a rearguard action diplomatically, trying to kind of figure out, how on earth they salvage something from this. It really smacks not just of 19th century or early 20th century secret diplomacy, but frankly of 18th century. Trump is going to preside next year over the 250th anniversary of American independence.
This is what I was talking about earlier. So this harkening back to old school diplomacy in terms of imperial activity of invading and this and that, rather than doing trade. The modern era, we thought, was an era where we would get influence and power through doing trade, and we'd find value in trade. Whereas, Trump's looking at Canada and Greenland and saying, well, we could put our bases on Greenland, and we could, do some jiggery pokery with Denmark, and or we could just invade it and just take control over the whole lot and have it. Might as well. I mean, we're one of the most powerful. So you're getting back to that old school imperialistic outlook.
The American Revolution. And at that same time frame, if you kind of look back to that later part of the 18th century, there was all kinds of diplomacy going on in Europe over the heads of other countries. There was the partition of Poland, for example. We're in that kind of historic space. And that's, something that most of us would never have anticipated, given how far we've gone in this last 250 years. But we seem to be just right back to that whole period where great powers just think that they can carve up the world and then make everybody else go along with it.
There you go. Absolutely fascinating. Then we're going to go to the very last part, but actually this is quite a long excerpt we're going to look at here.
So you've worked on Russia policy across 3 different administrations, Bush, Obama, and Trump.
Scott Galloway.
So I want to ask a more basic question, and that is, it is difficult for a lot of us to understand the end game here and the strategy behind what Trump's approach to Ukraine. It feels as if he started the negotiation with Russia by folding. Like, okay, you can have everything, now let's start the negotiation. And from someone such as myself, who I think has a bias against Trump, it feels to me like Putin has agreed to buy billions of dollars of Trump coin, and that in exchange, they've decided they're going to have 2 spheres of influence between 2 autocrats and carve up the world for their own financial benefit. Steel man a more logical explanation of the current complexion of Trump as it relates to Ukraine. In sum, what are they thinking? What is the end game?
Well, look, this isn't about America, Scott. Let's be frank. And, if I really kind of think about it, I mean, you cover this a lot on your podcast. It's the kind of thing that I also look at. This whole deindustrialization of the United States. I wrote a book a few years ago about this in the United States, Russia, and UK context. There's a whole host of issues that have been decades in the making that need to be addressed, and this is one way of doing them. Basically a convergence between Russia and the United States. It's a convergence of autocratic thinking, to be honest. I mean, we're talking about the very top of our economic pyramid here, and it's really driven in a large part by Trump and his own worldview, and I'll get to that in a second, but also by people like Elon Musk. I mean, Musk has a vested interest, I mentioned this earlier, in basically engaging directly with Russia. I think he's been a big driver of this as well. In parts, it's for Starlink and for the relay stations, the terrestrial relay stations. He needs to have global coverage. Russia is the largest territory in the world, along with China and then, Iran, as well as the United States, Canada, all these giant countries. He needs to have those within his frame for his business to succeed. And look at SpaceX. It developed using, the first rocketry and all of the systems developed first in the Soviet Union, Russia. The first inventor of the rocket ship was a Russian scientist, an autodidact, very similar to Musk, frankly, back at the period before the Russian Revolution. So the Soviet Union and Russia have been the pioneers in space. And as I said, there's now discussions going on about how to work for Musk with the Russian Space Agency, the Russian Atomic Agency, et cetera, et cetera. So there's that. And then there's also this great desire that Trump has had since the 1980s of doing business with the Soviet Union and with Russia on a whole host of different fronts from his family perspective. And that's definitely out there. And you mentioned cryptocurrency and all the other kinds of issues that are out there on the table. So that's a major part of this. Of course it is. And it's autocrat to autocrat, oligarch to oligarch, very similar sort of setup here. It's got nothing to do with Americans, particularly given back, as we said before, about the paucity of the trade relationship between Russia and the United States in the past. But it could be very significant in this few set of areas. But the other thing is, and Trump is genuine about this.
She goes on to talk about nuclear and how that is something that really, really motivates him. And that's why he keeps mentioning it. He has done for a long time. That is really important to him. Nuclear safety and wanting to make sure the world doesn't self-destruct in that way. And yeah, that is definitely seems to be something that motivates him. But I guess what we've seen so far is that, or through the course of this video, is that the answer to the question of is it this, that, or the other, the answer is yes. Yes, it is. And we'll just go to one final section, which kind of looks to where it's all going. So, given what we know about Trump, is kind of the question. Where do we go from here? What does it look like? What does the US do? What's its course of action? And Fiona Hill answers this in an interesting way, because essentially it's not about the United States. It's about one guy, really. And then you can say, well, is it about one guy, or is it about a whole set of guys with a whole bunch of different objectives? The South African oligarchs, Project 2025, J.D. Vance, who is very much in that South African oligarch. He was put through, he became a senator because of Peter Thiel and the funding of Peter Thiel. He was Peter Thiel's hedge fund, worked for his hedge fund firm, I believe, and he's something of Peter Thiel's protege. But then these other people in government who have their own agenda. And as I've said already a number of times, Trump is eminently susceptible, vulnerable to influence from these people, because he just sees all of this as they flatter him, and if they promise him power, and he is just driven by that sense of gaining more and more power.
Rest of 25 and into 26.
Well, it is difficult, because we're not talking really about the United States, let's be frank. We're talking about one guy and a group of people around him. I mean, that is kind of unprecedented. We're talking about Trump. Because I think for Putin, and sometimes I mix the two up myself, because there's a very similar, outlook and, often sometimes game plan. But there's, and also in terms of, the unchecked nature of their power. But there's a couple of very specific differences between the two, which are very important in thinking about how this plays out. First of all, Putin's been in power for 25 years. And the people around him are the people who've been around him for decades. They know their stuff. They have a proper plan. Basically, Putin wants to dominate again. the regions that were formerly part of the Russian Empire, formerly part of the Soviet Union, one way or another. Doesn't mean that he's going to send in tanks, here, there, and everywhere, but he wants the veto on what they do, what they say, where they go. And he certainly doesn't want them to have any other options. And he's absolutely hell-bent, on basically preventing the Europeans from getting their act together as well. There's all these acts of sabotage, and I said, and psychological operations and interference going on there all the time as well. Now, Trump also doesn't want Europe to get their act together, but, for all kinds of different reasons. I mean, actually, Trump and Putin both don't want to see NATO continue. Trump thinks it's because Europe rips him off or rips the US off. And he's not wrong that Europe should have been doing a heck of a lot more for a lot longer time about its own security. And they should have got this message decades ago, not even just when Obama made the points in 2014 after Russia had annexed Crimea. But there's been every conceivable US administration going back to the 1960s and to Kennedy. There's been actually saying to Europe, come on, get going. This is not just all reliance on the US time. And that's beyond, obviously, the strategic nuclear umbrella, but in terms of building up and taking up more responsibility for their security. Now, of course, Europe thought after 1989, this is great, peace dividend, we can just kind of move on and do other things. But, that message has still been coming through loud and clear. So actually, Trump now is basically saying the Europeans are right, you're on your own. That's catnip for Putin. That's fantastic. The fact that Trump's basically saying we're not going to give Article 5 guarantees to Europe unless it's Article 5%. They have to be paying 5% of their GDP, and otherwise, we might not even contemplate supporting them under extreme circumstance. That's another thing that Putin's been looking for. So, I mean, basically what I'm trying to say here is what it's more likely to be is that the United States is going to be supporting the Russian position because there's so many things that, Trump actually also sees eye to eye with Putin on. But we're going to end up in an extraordinarily messy situation. That's really what I foresee. I foresee in my crystal ball, it's very cloudy. There's all kinds of, things going on, all over the place. And in part, that comes down to the other big difference between Trump and Putin, is Trump is a totally one-man show. He's destroying the state. He's not acting with Congress and with the Senate, unless they're like rubber stamps, which actually for Putin also, the Russian Duma, the Russian parliament's also a rubber stamp. But Putin operates within the state. He's a creature of the deep state. He's not dismantling the Russian state. That was already dismantled, under Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin from the Soviet and Russian times. That the Russians have moved on beyond that. He works through his state negotiators, Lavrov, the foreign minister, for example, his advisors, Ushakov, as well as through oligarchs and business people. They all work for him, and they're all one very tight team. For Trump, he doesn't really pay any attention to any of the people around him. He uses them as emissaries and envoys, but he doesn't do his homework. They can't actually advise him on anything. They just kind of come back. God knows what kind of conversations they have. Do they have notes? Do they fully understand, what they've heard? And that makes Trump very unpredictable. So I think if Putin's looking at his own crystal ball, he also can't say where this is going to go. He's going to have to be constantly on the ball, not just the crystal ball, but on the other ball, trying to kind of figure out how he can push Trump in his direction. And so things will change very dramatically if others push back, if the Europeans push back, for example, or if any part of the US firmament pushes back as well. If Congress, suddenly realize that they're a co-equal branch of government and have their own powers, or if the Senate do. So there's all kinds of different constraints there. And in Trump 1.0, Putin was very frustrated because he thought that Trump would already do a lot of the things he's already doing now, but there were all kinds of constraints. So unfortunately, what I foresee here is a mess. I could actually see that there could be a truce, there could be a ceasefire, but then it's when all of these other externalities, all of these other independent variables come into play. So I fear that we're going to be in this very messy situation for some time, but gets back to what you said again. There could be a more positive outcome if the Europeans move very quickly to get their act together. And there is signs of that, but they've got to have the political will. And they've also got to realize that they can't depend on the United States and that they also have to kind of come up with some kind of solution there.
So essentially, it's all about Europe, really, in terms of frustrating the objectives of both Russia and indeed the US, that seems to be aligning with Russia for all of the reasons we talked about. So it's a bit of everything is the is a kind of takeaway from this. But I really think some of these, all of these people had an interesting way of phrasing and talking about what they think Trump is all about with regard to foreign policy. Let me know what you think, and whether you agree or disagree with this analysis. And in the meantime, take care, and I'll speak to you soon.